Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into what I think is literally one of the most fascinating historical mysteries of the modern age. I mean, think about it. How exactly did Scotland, which at the dawn of the 18th century was arguably the poorest, most underdeveloped nation in Western Europe, suddenly rise up to essentially invent the modern world? It's a crazy story. We're talking about tragic loss, unbelievable resilience, and a completely staggering intellectual explosion. Let's actually kick things off with a quote that really sets the stage perfectly here. We look to Scotland for all our ideas on civilization. Now, that wasn't said by some proud Scotsman. That was written by Voltaire, the leading figure of the French Enlightenment himself. I think it just perfectly captures that profound, almost stunned respect that 18th century Europe had for Scottish intellect. But, to really understand how Scotland achieved this towering reputation, we have to rewind a bit and look at the intense political and economic crisis that started the whole shebang. Section 1. The 1707 Act of Union. So, to really wrap our heads around this Scottish miracle, we need to look impartially at the rather desperate landscape of early 18th century Scotland. It kind of made this union with England a historical necessity. See, since 1603 with the Union of the Crowns, England and Scotland had shared a monarch, but their parliaments and national institutions still fiercely independent. But by the late 1700s, the late 1600s, England was blowing up as a global maritime power. They were fiercely protecting their trade with mercantilist policies that totally shut Scotland out in the cold. Desperate to compete, Scotland tried to launch its own colonial project in 1695, the Darien Scheme, in Panama. And guys, it was an absolute catastrophe. That massive failure directly paved the way to the 1707 Act of Union, which officially merged the two parliaments. 400,000. Just let that massive number sink in for a second. That represents the gold coins invested and completely lost in that disastrous Darien colonial scheme. To put that into perspective, it amounted to nearly half of the available wealth in all of Scotland. Half. The nation was practically bankrupted overnight. This financial ruin basically forced Scotland's hand. They had to accept the 1707 Act of Union, which sure opened up those lucrative English colonial markets to Scottish merchants, but it absolutely cost them their political independence. Section 2. The Twilight of the Clans. Now, shifting to the profound cultural impact of this political tectonic shift, we absolutely have to look at the ancient semi-feudal Highland clan system. While the lowlands were busy integrating into this shiny new global economy, the Highlands were basically living on borrowed time. So how do ancient societies actually crumble from within? Well, there was this fatal contradiction sitting right at the heart of the clans. Traditional Highland culture was built on dúchas, this collective belief that clan members had an inherent right to settle on the lands protected by their chief. But right alongside that, you had oigred, the strict legal feudal ownership of that exact same land by the elite clan chiefs. For centuries, these totally opposite concepts somehow coexisted. But as those clan chiefs started treating their territories more like personal real estate portfolios and way less like communal trusts, the whole societal fabric of the Highlands just started to tear apart. And this internal tension, it was violently accelerated by external politics. The 1745 Jacobite uprising, which was an attempt to restore the Stuart monarchy, drew incredibly heavily on the military power of those Highland clans. Well, when it failed, the British government responded with severe, overwhelming force. The Duke of Cumberland led a brutal pacification of the Highlands, deliberately and systematically dismantling the clan structures. This whole campaign culminated in the 1746 Dress Act, which literally banned the wearing of traditional tartans and kilts. The goal was to erase the warrior identity of the Highlands forever. But the cultural erasure definitely didn't stop at military defeat. It was heavily compounded by some really harsh economic realities known as the Highland Clearances. As the British agricultural revolution gained momentum, clan chiefs, who were now fully operating as capitalist landlords, figured out that sheep were just way more profitable than people. This realization led to brutal, forced evictions of their very own clan members. We're talking about entire communities being cleared out, pushed to the harsh coastlines, crammed into lowland cities, or just packed onto ships bound for the American colonies. The traditional Highland way of life was, for all intents and purposes, liquidated. So the really wild takeaway here is this. That popular, cozy image we have of Scottish clans today, it's largely an illusion. Those highly standardized tartans and clan crests we all recognize were actually romanticized and, honestly, in many ways, completely invented in the 19th century by writers like Walter Scott and later fully embraced by Queen Victoria. It was the safe, sanitized Victorian romanticism. And it was popularized long, long after the actual living clan system had been completely destroyed. Section 3. The Scottish Miracle. But, history is rarely just a one-dimensional story. Right at the exact same time as the tragic fall of the Highland clans, the Scottish lowlands were experiencing an absolutely astonishing rise. The seeds of this miracle were actually planted much earlier, and surprisingly, they were driven by religion. Following John Knox's Calvinist Reformation way back in 1560, there was the strict religious requirement that every single individual should be able to read the Bible, and that rule led directly to the creation of parish schools in virtually every single community. On top of that, university tuition in Scotland was roughly 10 times cheaper than down at Oxford in England. The totally unintended consequence of all this intense religious devotion, it created a highly educated, deeply analytical working class. Get this. By 1750, the male literacy rate in Scotland hit a massive 75%. For the 18th century, that figure is just absolutely revolutionary. You literally had bakers, blacksmiths, and farmers checking out complex works of philosophy and science from their local libraries. The groundwork was incredibly fertile for a huge intellectual explosion. Section 4, the Enlightenment and Progress. So, what happens when that super-literate society suddenly gains access to the sprawling global markets of the British Empire after the 1707 Act of Union? Boom! The Scottish Enlightenment. Scotland totally transformed into a global powerhouse of practical, empirical thought, churning out an incredible roster of absolute geniuses. Take just 3 of the titans from this era. You've got Adam Smith, who essentially founded modern economics and the theory of the free market with The Wealth of Nations. You have David Hume, an absolute giant of philosophy who championed empiricism and inductive reasoning. And then there's James Watt, whose brilliant improvements to the steam engine directly drove the Industrial Revolution. What really united all these guys was a profound shift away from abstract theories and toward practical, world-changing applications. Because you see, the Scottish Enlightenment was uniquely practical, while the French Enlightenment over on the continent focused really heavily on pure reason and high-level abstract political theory. The Scots, they focused on empirical observation and everyday utility. They weren't just about sitting around and thinking. They were about doing, measuring, building, and mechanizing agriculture and industry. They desperately wanted to figure out how human beings actually behaved, how economies practically functioned, and how machines could be built to tangibly improve society. Section 5, a global legacy. Now, this profound transformation obviously didn't just stay neatly contained within the borders of Scotland. It leaked out, and it directly shaped the modern world you and I are living in today. To really grasp the scale of this legacy, consider this insane statistic. Between 8 million and 20 million people in the United States today are of Scottish descent. That is a staggering number of people. This massive diaspora was driven by the 2 deeply contrasting forces we've been talking about: the brutal, forced displacements of the Highland clearances and the highly ambitious search for new global markets by all those well-educated Scottish merchants and engineers. And as they spread out, they carried the core ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, ideas like free trade, empirical science, and individual liberty, straight into the foundation of the modern world. Which brings us to a really heavy final thought. Scotland's story is undeniably one of a miraculous leap forward in human progress, economics, and science. A real game changer. But that huge leap occurred at the exact same time, and often under the same systems, as the systematic destruction of an ancient communal way of life in the Highlands. So as we sit here benefiting from the modern world that the Scots helped invent, we kind of have to ask ourselves, is the modern world worth the price of a lost culture? It's a really complex, provocative question, and definitely one worth pondering long after this explainer ends. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the history that shaped our world.